Hey, welcome Trinity United Methodist Church family and friends. Glad you are joining us. This is our second section of United Methodist Church history, polity, and doctrine. This is session 2 on polity. Now, polity is just another word for structure or organization. And you may hear around town, so to speak, that the word that best describes the United Methodist polity is one of connectionalism. We'll talk about that in a bit. But first, I want you to know that I have lit the candle. Christ is present in this place, calls us to be the light. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, and you are the light of the world. And we are called to be that light, and it's always a good reminder for me. So I light a candle. The scripture, I'm going back to the same scripture from session 1. I just want you to hear it again. This is from Acts chapter 15, and beginning first verse, the council at Jerusalem. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. So they were sent on their way by the church, and as they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, they reported the conversion of the Gentiles and brought great joy to all the believers. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and said, it is necessary for them to be circumcised and ordered to keep the law of Moses. The apostles and the elders met together to consider this matter. After there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, my brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you, that I should be the one through whom the Gentiles would hear the message of the good news and become believers. And God, who knows the human heart, testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. And in cleansing their hearts by faith, he has made no distinction between them and us. The Word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. So it's always good to go back and hear that councils, conferencing has been from the very beginning of the church. And John Wesley certainly continued that tradition by what he called holy conferencing. Let's talk a little bit about the structure now. Now, recall my little history lesson, if you will, from session 1, that Methodism began as only a renewal movement within the Church of England. Remember, the Church of England broke off from the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Catholic means universal. So they came from the universal Roman Catholic Church. They broke off because the king wanted a divorce. The Pope wouldn't grant it. So it became the Church of England. John and Charles Wesley were both priests in the Church of England. Started a renewal movement within Oxford University called the Holy Club. Later became known as the Methodists. And it jumped across the pond. And when it jumped across the pond, that's when things got really interesting. Recall that the Declaration of Independence, 1776, we declared our independence from England and set up an experiment, if you will. 3 branches of government: the executive branch, legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Of course, president, vice president, the Congress, House, and Senate represented the legislation, and judicial is Supreme Court. A few years after that, 1784, was the Christmas conference at Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore was the main harbor, the main port of entry at that time, not New York. It was Baltimore. So all immigrants were coming in through Baltimore. That's why the Christmas conference was held in Baltimore. Lovely Lane was built shortly after Otterbein Church. It was built first. Philip Otterbein, they used the bricks from the ballast of the boats to build their church. And the German-speaking and the English-speaking Methodists, if you will, all met at Otterbein Church first. Then Lovely Lane was built. 1784, the Christmas conference, and they break from the Church of England, established the Methodist Church in America, the Methodist Episcopal Church in America, I should say. So how did they set it up? Well, they set it up in a very similar way to the new grand experiment that the country had set up. So we have three branches of government, if you will, within the United Methodist Church: the executive branch, legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Executive branch is sometimes called spiritual branch as well. This is the Council of Bishops. The Council of Bishops is made up of all living bishops, retired and still working. So all bishops make up the Council of Bishops. The legislative branch, for us, the highest body of the legislative branch is General Conference. We'll talk a little bit more and break that down a little bit more for you in a minute. Judicial branch is Judicial Council. Our Judicial Council is made up of 4 clergy, 4 laity, plus 1. So these are all nominated and elected folks, all of them. General Conference is 50% laity, 50% clergy, elected delegates. Judicial Council is not quite 50-50. So it's 4 clergy that's been nominated and elected at General Conference to serve on the Judicial Council. So Judicial Council is always 9 people. It's equivalent to our Supreme Court. Their word is final. So when they rule, it's done. Now, the Council of Bishops or General Conference can sign a petition asking them to review again, but it rarely does very much unless there's new evidence that has brought forth. So 9 members, Judicial Council from all over the global United Methodist Church, 4 clergy, 4 laity, plus 1. That plus 1 rotates between clergy and laity. You're elected for 8-year terms. So for 8 years, it's clergy. For 8 years, it's laity. And it goes back and forth in that manner. All right. So that's our branches of government in the United Methodist Church, if you will. Let's talk about General Conference and our legislative body. So we have legislative bodies, if you will, beginning in the local church. But I'm going to start and go down, and then we're going to kind of work our way back up, all right? So, General Conference is made up of all United Methodist churches. So, these are elected delegates. In the General Conference 2022 now that it's going to be, it was supposed to be 2020, was postponed twice because of COVID, okay? 862 delegates from all over. We'll talk about what all over means in a moment. We also have jurisdictional conferences. Jurisdictional conferences are in the U.S. There are 5. There is the Northeast, North Central, Southeast, South Central, and Western jurisdictions. You can guess we're in the Southeast. South Carolina is about as Southeast as you can get, right? So we're in the Southeastern jurisdiction. Central conferences are conferences outside of the U.S., and they are more like jurisdictional conferences. They actually can represent various countries because of the number of Methodists, and they make up different annual conferences. So, for example, I know of one in a Europe Central Conference that has 15 countries in it. No, let me rephrase that. 15 annual conferences making up about 12 different countries. So that shows you where Central Conference is. They get delegates as well. Annual conference is South Carolina. So that's our annual conference. Not all annual conferences go by state borders. Georgia, for example, has two, North Georgia and Georgia. North Carolina has two, Western North Carolina and North Carolina. Tennessee, my home state, has 3 conferences, but only 2 bishops. So it gets a little tricky. So we have the Memphis Conference, Tennessee Conference, they share 1 bishop. And then the Holston Conference is East Tennessee, Southwestern Virginia. So that makes up annual conferences. And then each annual conference have districts within it. Obviously, Trinity United Methodist Church in Anderson is in the Anderson District. And districts then, of course, have local churches and charges. We have, I believe, in the Anderson District, 74 churches, and a charge is more than, if one pastor serves more than one church. We have 49, I believe it is, charges serving 74 local churches in the Anderson District. So each church sends delegates to annual conference. Okay? So we nominate through our local church and charge conference delegates that we send to annual conference. Annual conference votes, laity votes for laity, clergy votes for clergy. And we send then 50% clergy, 50% laity to jurisdictional conference and general conference. Jurisdictional conference, I would say the biggest thing that they're known for is this is where you elect your bishops. So bishops are elected out of the jurisdictional conference. So they look at Southeastern Jurisdictional Conference, and if there's 5 bishops that are retiring, then they need to elect 5 to serve the Southeastern jurisdiction. So bishops stay within a jurisdiction. Okay, that is some of our makeup there. I'm going to say more, but first I wanted to introduce to you someone who you might know. He served here as youth director for many years, more than a decade, I think like 16 years or something. And then he was asked to serve on the conference staff. He's something that a conference calls a congregational specialist, and he serves the area of Rock Hill and Spartanburg too, right? Chris Lynch, and Chris Lynch is a delegate to jurisdictional and general conference for 2022. I'm going to let him say a few words. And let me say this, though. We have 32 out of South Carolina Annual Conference. There's 32 delegates. Again, 16 clergy, 16 laity. They'll be attending jurisdictional conference. And we have 16 then, half of that, 8 clergy, 8 laity, that will go as delegates to general conference. All right? So let me introduce you to Mr. Chris Lynch, and he can tell you a little bit about him as a delegate, and then I'll talk a little bit about what all makes up the United Methodist Church and what doesn't, because that's very important as well. All right, Chris Lynch.
Greetings. As Reverend Mitchell mentioned, my name is Chris Lynch, and I have the privilege and honor of serving the South Carolina Conference as a delegate to Southeastern Jurisdictional Conference and General Conference in 2022. Rory asked me to share a little bit about my experience, how I was elected. So the election process at annual conference for laity, which I am a lay member, is laity or apply to be on the ballot and then go through the election process, which is very similar to clergy. All clergy are automatically on the ballot unless they opt out. And so the way the election process works is that there are around 1,600, members of annual conference who are voting members of annual conference. And so during our regular annual conference meeting, I almost said general conference, and that would be really confusing with all of this. The regular annual conference meeting, in the midst of all the business and the worship, they pause and take ballots for election for delegates for general and jurisdictional conference. Depending on the number of delegates who are actually in the session, in order to be elected, you have to receive 50% plus one votes of the total number of laity or clergy who are elected. And so in 2019, I had to go back and think, now that the numbers have changed, the years have changed. In 2019, I was the fifth layperson elected in South Carolina, which means that I am a delegate for Southeastern Jurisdictional Conference and General Conference that was supposed to take place last year, but now will take place next year. So that's a little bit about how I was elected. Roy mentioned that jurisdictional conference, the major emphasis at jurisdictional conference is electing bishops. We also spend time there finalizing budgets, approving budgets, electing and jurisdictional committee members, among other things. Of course, at both jurisdictional and general conference, there are opportunities for worship as well, which is a powerful thing. I was a delegate to jurisdictional conference in 2016, so I'm pretty familiar with how what that looks like and how that feels. It was a great experience. The general conference thing is something I have not yet experienced. I'm looking forward to, but as he mentioned, that is the place where legislation is considered and passed or not passed. It is the only body that can speak for the Methodist Church. So that's been one of the things over the last few years. You've heard lots of rumors as different proposals have been presented and considered. That lots of times those things get reported as changes that are already in place. The reality is nothing has changed until general conference occurs. So the way that works a little bit is there are both, as he mentioned, 862 delegates. Those 862 delegates will eventually be in one large room together in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at a convention center there, and they will actually vote on which legislation should be passed and which legislation should not be passed. There is a little bit of a process, so it's a 10-day event. Jurisdictional conference is 5 days. General conference is 10 days. The first 5 days of general conference is spent in legislative committees. This general conference, there will be 14 legislative committees. So there is a long list of potential legislation that has been presented to general conference to be considered. It is then classified into one of 14 legislative committees. The first 5 days, you spend time in a legislative committee prioritizing the legislation and deciding in those legislative committees which pieces of legislation should be voted on in the general, in the main voting session the following week. Just to give you an idea, we think there's in the neighborhood of between 900 and 1,000 pieces of legislation that will be considered at General Conference 2022. If you really want to channel your inner Metho nerd, which is what I call a Methodist nerd who really digs this stuff, you too can go and download the Advanced Christian Daily Advocate. The ACDA is roughly a 1,000-page document that contains all of the reports from the general agencies and also contains all the legislation that will be considered. To give you an idea of what 1,000 pages looks like, I brought a ream of paper. So if I printed off the ACDA, it would take roughly all 500 pages of this ream of paper, front and back, to contain all of the information that will be considered at General Conference. If any of you out there would like to read through all that and make a Cliff's Notes version of it, I would be much obliged for that and appreciative of that. So that gives you an idea of the volume of information that we'll be processing and thinking through as we make those decisions. So once the legislative committees are done, there are 14 of those, and they are really organized by, there are things like I will be on the local church legislative committee, which will consider legislation that deals directly with the local church, with local churches. Some of the other legislative committees are things like Board of Ordained Ministry and how they'll function, church and society, things along those lines are all those 14 legislative committees. Each delegate is, so our travel is covered for as part of the General Conference budget. So we will be flown out to Minnesota, or if you're close enough, you drive. Hotels are taken care of. They also give us a stipend for meals, which means that I can eat McDonald's probably, maybe I might could mix in a Burger King every once in a while on the stipend they give us for meals and those sort of things. What you may or may not know is that the schedule is pretty intense, and that's one of the things I've heard from friends of mine who've been a part of general conferences in the past, is those 10 days are packed. I was kind of a little bit excited about the idea of visiting Minneapolis in Minnesota, but my understanding is you have very little time to do any kind of fun stuff. So it's a lot of work as we consider these things, and delegates are, as Roy mentioned, are elected at annual conference to serve in jurisdictional and general conference. We are elected and asked to vote our conscience. So it's not one of those things where we are necessarily representatives and we are listened to or have to vote what we think our conference might want us to vote. It is simply a vote of our conscience. So come 2022, I'll be looking forward to spending some time there. Would covet your prayers as that time arrives. It's been a long time coming, as the saying goes. We were supposed to have it last year, and now we'll be delayed at least 2 years. Hopefully all will be well in 2022, and I'll look forward to representing not only South Carolina, but Trinity as well, as we spend some time out in Minnesota in 2022. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Chris Lynch. So I wanted you to see that we actually have a delegate, which is highly unusual, thinking of 16 delegates, 8 clergy and 8 laity that's going to General Conference, and one of them comes out of this church. So that's pretty cool. But he said something very important that I want you to keep in mind. These are elected delegates. They are not representatives in the way that our Congress folks are supposed to be representatives. Every delegate is clearly told you are to vote your own conscience. So although they come out of the South Carolina Conference, they are voting with their head and with their heart, and it's on them. They do a lot of work. I am grateful for those who want to serve. I do not wish to serve in that capacity. So let's talk a little bit about the United Methodist Church and what it actually includes, because a lot of people don't understand this. And so in the 1800s, we had a massive wave of sending missionaries around the globe. So Oberlin College and Ohio Wesleyan in Ohio were the two areas that missionaries went through, United Methodist, or Methodist missionaries, I should say, and we sent them everywhere, okay? A lot of those churches that were established became autonomous churches. So all of Mexico, Central America, South America. I went to school in Brazil. I went to the Methodist Seminary in Mexico City. Those are not United Methodists. They are Methodists and part of our World Methodist Council and family, if you will, but they're not United Methodists. A lot of people don't know, and I've mentioned this in worship before, that the Methodist Church in Canada and Australia and I believe New Zealand combined in the 20s with, in 1925 in Canada, with the Presbyterians and Congregationalists to form the United Church of Canada. So they are part of our Methodist heritage and culture, but they're not United Methodists in those countries. So in Korea, the largest Methodist church in the world is in Korea, South Korea. However, During the Great Depression, I believe it was, the Korean Methodist Church became autonomous, not part of the United Methodist Church. So where is this global Methodist Church that we are talking about? So it is global in that it is in many countries, but they are kind of in specific geographical regions, if you will. So remember the merger in 1968. That formed the United Methodist Church, coming from the Methodist Episcopal South, Methodist Episcopal Protestant became the Methodist Church, and then the Evangelical Association and United Brethren became the EUBs, and then we merged together the Methodist Church and the EUBs to form the United Methodist Church in 1968. So, largely, the United Methodist Church are churches that have grown since that time, because most other places they were autonomous. So let me show you, I have a little graph here from U.S. churches, United Methodist churches, and outside of the U.S. This is very rough here, okay? But since the merger in 1968, we had about 11.2 million United Methodists in America in 1968. It has declined pretty steadily ever since. There are lots of reasons that we could point to: changing society, culture, just a decline of denominationalism and other things. The biggest, one of the biggest reasons, I guess this is somewhat my opinion and somewhat fact, and that is the changing in demographics. So we have gone from 1968 having more than 50% of the country living in rural areas to today about more than 80% lives in urban and suburban areas. So those wonderful county seat towns and county seat churches that was the bedrock of United Methodism in the 60s, such as in Bennettsville and Bishopville and Union and towns like that, those towns, if you've been through them lately, have eroded in many ways. They are not the same towns. No one stays in town because there's no job, so they move out to find work. And when you have that movement, then those county churches, county seat churches that used to have between 200 and 300 in worship, are now worshiping a lot less. So that's one of the big reasons for the decline in numbers. But as I said, it's not the only one. We could point to lots of variants there. Meanwhile, outside of the U.S., in certain places, the United Methodist has grown more than 300% a year. Significant growth. Where has that growth occurred? Mainly in two areas: in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Remember what's going on in 1968? We're in the height of the Vietnam War, right? We come out of that war, growth occurs in Vietnam and that area, and the Philippines. Vastly growing Methodist Church, United Methodist Church in the Philippines. Okay? Where else? On the continent of Africa. Africa University. One of the reasons for the growth of the United Methodist Church on the continent of Africa is that we built Africa University to be a university and a seminary for African students. That they broke the ground on it in 1991, about the same time that Yugoslavia was and the USSR were breaking apart. So that's another great reason for that growth of the United Methodist Church in those areas. Africa has 54 countries. If you know Africa very well, 54 nations on the continent of Africa. The northern part of Africa, you can almost draw a line or look at a map and look at where the equator goes. North Africa is almost all Muslim countries, okay? South Africa is almost all Christian countries. There in the middle, in that equator region, is very mixed countries, both Muslims, Christians, quickly growing United Methodist Church in those areas. So areas such as Nigeria, Kenya, Mozambique, Chad, Sudan, those areas, the United Methodist Church is really growing, not to mention in South Africa and some of the other places in the south of Africa. So those churches are really growing, okay? And then we do have some in Europe. Now, all of Western Europe is autonomous. They don't belong to the United Methodist Church. So England, our motherland, if you will, those countries is not part of the United Methodist Church. Part of World Methodist Council, but not part of the United Methodist Church. What is mainly former Soviet Union countries or former Yugoslavian countries, communist countries that was once communist at least. Of course, the breakup of the Soviet Union and then the breakup of Yugoslavia in the mid-90s created a bunch of their own countries. So we began growing in those. That was after, of course, the merger. So in countries such as Estonia and Slovenia and those countries, Lithuania, we are growing not as fast as we do in Southeast Asia and Africa, but we're growing a little bit in those countries. It includes a little bit of Scandinavia as well. We have a central conference that includes Finland and I believe Sweden. Northern part of Germany is actually in that because northern Germany, when you get to the tip there, you're very close to Scandinavia and they have Scandinavian qualities. So that is what includes the United Methodist Church. Many churches, and this is reality as well, if they could afford to be autonomous, then they usually become autonomous. So a lot of conferences that have received a lot of funding from the U.S. Continue in the United Methodist Church. We have a good relationship. So we've been, Philippines, for example, have talked about going autonomous. They certainly have the means to do so. But we've had such a good relationship with them. They really want to remain United Methodist and not be autonomous Filipino Methodist Church. So we'll see what happens there. But I wanted you to understand where the United Methodist Church actually is and where it is not. We are in lots of countries that speaks lots of different languages. So as Chris mentioned, when they break up in their legislative committees, those 14 committees, they will have probably at least 14 languages in each committee. So they break those 1,000 pieces of legislation up into 80 to or so pieces of legislation per committee. And they look at those, and in each room, they're going to have 14 different languages and translators looking at 80 pieces of legislation to decide what moves on to the floor at General Conference and what doesn't go past the Legislative Committee. So it is a daunting process. I am amazed. I did attend General Conference as just a attendee, a look-seer, if you will, in 2004 when it was in Pittsburgh, because I was in Columbus, Ohio at the time, and Pittsburgh about a 3-hour drive. So I drove over for one day and attended General Conference in 2004. And it's pretty fascinating experience, to say the least. Okay, General Conference in Minneapolis, 862 delegates, half clergy, half laity. Of those delegates, 55.9% will be from the U.S., 32% from Africa, 6% from the Philippines, 4.6% from Europe, and that's those European countries that I mentioned. And then we have the remainder from the concordant churches. Why? I have no idea. We give 10 delegates to Great Britain, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Puerto Rico. Why? Because we can, I suppose. They've always done it that way. They're not officially United Methodists, but they get 10 delegates anyway. Go figure. I don't know why. The largest single delegation is 50 people. That comes from the North Cantaga Conference in the Dominican Republic of the Congo. The largest U.S. delegations, each with 22, is North Georgia and Virginia conferences. The 2022 General Conference will include delegations from 5 new annual conferences created in 2016. Those are from Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, South Sudan, Rwanda Provisional, Northeast Nigeria, and 100 Islands Conference in the Philippines. That's where the growth is occurring. So I was going to say this, and I didn't finish my thought, but 2020, for the first time ever, we now know this, at the end of 2020, the numbers of United Methodists outside the U.S. now outnumber those within the U.S. So that's something to be aware of. We're about 12.5 million worldwide now. So 1968, about 11.2 million of Methodists, United Methodists in the U.S. That has declined to about 6 million, while those outside has grown to 6.5 million now, almost. All right, I think I have said enough, probably fogged up your brain. I do want to end with this prayer and also remind you that session 3, we will look at a little bit of the book of discipline. I'll mention the book of resolutions. What is that? Social principles, and we'll look at some of the legislation that is being brought forward about a potential reorganization or split or splinter of the United Methodist Church. Again, nobody knows what's going to happen until that legislation hits the floor. I'll talk a little bit more about that next session. Hope you got something out of this. Remember, it comes with a money-back guarantee. If you didn't learn something new, then I will refund the cost of the ticket. All right, we're going to pray our covenant prayer in the Wesleyan tradition together. Thanks for joining us. I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Place me with whom you will. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be put to work for you or set aside for you. Praise for you or criticize for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. Let me have all things, let me have nothing. I freely and fully surrender all things to your glory and service. And now, O wonderful and holy God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, you are mine, and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it also be made in heaven. Amen. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.